That's okay. Chris.
I wonder if anyone else who worked the polls had the problem we had at our precinct. I was alpha presiding judge for 3 precincts in Wellington. At, I don't know, around noon, we had 21 machines. At around noon, they started shutting down because they ran out of paper.
Really?
Really.
That sounds like no turnout when you run out of paper.
Because the ballots were so long, they should have anticipated that. We had hundreds of paper ballots, we had hundreds of provisional ballots, custom ballots printed in stock, ready for all the people that were going to come use them that didn't. But blank rolls of paper, they did not have. I called, it took them hours to come out. From about noon on, they started shutting down, and then they all started shutting down because I had to guide each person to a machine because of the layout. That's a whole nother story. But I made sure that they were all being used equally. And so once they started running out of paper, then they all started running out of paper at about the 80th ballot. I didn't get replacements for hours. When they finally came in around 4 or 5 o'clock, I had 9 machines down. They replaced 4 rolls of paper in 4 machines, didn't have any more paper, left, didn't come back again for over 2 hours. So I had insanity.
We didn't have that problem around.
Okay. Well, I think we've got a couple of our action areas for next year. One of them is the election process, voter ID, election fraud, etc. The other one is the minority culture. And we've been running a trial balloon by Freedom Works and some of the other organizations to get some funding for a Raging Elephants type initiative. So anybody interested in doing that, please make sure we know about it so we can call upon you if we get something going.
Jim, just a real quick thing on that. I'm on Twitter and I follow several conservative blacks as well as conservative gays. That's a lot of funny. But anyway, they one of the conservative blacks says he has voted Republican. I think he's in Illinois. He's voted Republican in the last several elections predominantly, and yet he received calls from the Obama campaign asking for his vote. He never once was contacted by a Republican. So something's wrong. If he's on the list as having voted Republican, he should have gotten some contact from the Republicans. But apparently he was in a I don't know exactly where it is, but he says, he just didn't think that made a lot of sense. That they need to reach out to these minorities in the cities, especially when they show that Republican.
I did some of that. I worked phones for Renee Cedar in law, and I said, why don't we do Ellie House? He said, these are people who we've identified as either independent, and they're not necessarily the Republicans. They were the independents that we could win over. There was no Republicans we contacted, and no Democrats at all. So, we didn't have a chance to say, hey, and she just said, you didn't get a call from the Republican.
You got no mail, no anything from the Republican, even though he has voted predominantly Republican.
Yeah. Well, the targeting was all off, and one of the questions I had was all these phone calls and door knocks that went on for months, and all that data was loaded into a database, and then for the election day turnout, they used a different database. How stupid is that?
You know, Jim, it's a lot more easy to manipulate paper ballots.
Absolutely.
We go back to paper ballots, cut out half of this early voting, except for 3 cases, eliminate all
that's an interesting question, and I think a lot of us have an opinion on it. And I see a show of hands, how many people think we should go back to hard copy ballots, physical paper ballots? Anybody that prefers the electronic?
We used to get it done. Why can't we do it now? Everybody should count paper ballots too. A lot more people that have
help with doing this.
Okay, so we're gonna create more government workers, look, there's 20 million.
I'm speaking locally.
Okay, I understand, I'm just being a smart ass, but look, why can't we have a national election holiday, or make it 2 days? It's a holiday and everybody votes on those 2 days. Why do we spend it I think that would go a long way towards getting rid of fraud.
Yeah, well, I think it's absurd when voting begins in Ohio before the first presidential debate. And that's insane. Anyway, we've had a good discussion, and maybe we'll have a little bit more, but we have a guest speaker this morning, and I'm very anxious to hear from him. Dan Jarvis, I introduced him in the last meeting as my favorite preacher, and he's one of the old-time preachers that believes that part of his role is to be politically informed and active.
All right.
All right, well, let me get settled here. Everybody can hear me okay? I did just turn the heater up, so hopefully that'll help a little bit.
Or make you go to sleep.
I thought we could start, before I give you my thoughts, I thought maybe you'd like to share some of your thoughts on this question. I believe that political momentum is determined by cultural momentum. What determines cultural momentum? So just for 2 minutes, just for kind of a warm-up, turn to your table around you and just give your best shot at an answer. What determines cultural momentum? What makes our culture what it is? All right, so go to it.
The government should what?
A lot of people
Yeah, should be advising like
free ride.
oh, the government should.
Angle, freebie anymore. There's something else for them, I cast my vote to a certain party, and I'm gonna get something. I'd rather leave their firm that way. So I'm going out on election, I'm voting.
Okay, raise your hand if someone at your table said the word family. Okay, that's a pretty big one, right? Any other obvious, what do you think? Schools, sure, education, media, values, which are unfortunately determined by media and schools and broken families. I mean, all these things tie together, right?
Your family.
Yeah.
Hollywood.
Yeah, sure. Your subcultural context a lot of times overrides even more information. Somebody could tell you something, you say, well, it doesn't matter to me because everyone who I think is like me is, for example, an Obama supporter, so I have to be too. So there's not really much thought that goes into it sometimes. Now, we can do that too, right? That's all over the place. We have to be more thoughtful, of course. Something interesting that happened in America's history. There were 2 massive waves of cultural change, and in the history books they call those the spiritual awakenings. And the first spiritual awakening came just before the Revolution. And many people say, many historians would say that movement of change on the spiritual side in the churches propelled then the cultural strength that allowed the revolution to happen as it did. To mount a revolution in that context, you have to have a tremendous amount of cultural strength and cultural commonality. And then there was a second Great Awakening a few decades later that is attributed to the founding of this republic when the Constitution was signed. And how could you get people over such a wide area geographically to all come together with common values? And some of it was those spiritual awakenings which resulted in a cultural shift in America, a shift away from old world Europe and the model of command and control, tyrannical type kings and princes and dukes and lords. Why would we go a different direction when that's where we all came from, these original settlers? There were some major spiritual and cultural things that happened. And what I'd like to suggest today is that more than anything, is what we need to happen again. I think you could even state it this way: a spiritual awakening that results in a cultural renewal. Now, there's different levels at which we operate. Would you agree with that? That kind of churches have their place and they do a certain function. And if they do their function well, in theory, that should take care of the spiritual side and the spiritual side of the values. But there's also a cultural side, and we look around, and one thing I've heard since November 6th, people just talking, is they say, wow, it feels like we've lost the culture. How could we get to a point where even with in theory, all the cards stacked in our favor, everything that we would need to make the case that conservatism is how our nation should be governed, how could still people walk into a voting booth? And whether there was fraud or not, we know millions of people still thought Obama should get rehired. And you say, how can that happen? Well, it's not just about political information. If it was just simply about economics or about political philosophy, we would have won. We know we're right. It's not a question of whether our values are correct politically. The issue is that people are voting in a broader cultural context, not just per whatever argument they heard on TV or an attack ad that they heard on the radio. So I've been giving a lot of thought since probably, I don't know when the moment, when it hit you on that Tuesday night. For me, I suppose, I'm trying to think back, probably about 9:45, maybe a little bit before that. You just had that sinking feeling, and you went, oh no, this is bad. We just lost. And not just the presidential race, but really a whole host of things that indicate that America is a lot different today than it was 30 years ago. And so the way that we built political momentum 30 years ago isn't going to work in the future if there's not really a majority of people out there that comprehend conservatism. See, I grew up in a very conservative family and in a church that supported the spiritual side of those conservative values, and it seemed like even if you went back maybe 10 or 15 years, people would say this, oh, we're a center-right country. You've heard that before. And the assumption is if we just get the word out about what our candidates believe versus what their candidates believe, most people will trend conservative, because in their hearts, that's really who they are. And I think it was November 6th of this year that we started to go, that may not be the case. Now, I still think that presented with all the facts and without the media bias, people are still going to come out conservative if they really think it through. But we know that the culture is not driving people that direction. The education system certainly isn't. Very frankly, the churches aren't. And so overall, we have a pretty big mountain to climb that's beyond get out the vote efforts and beyond simply making a case for a given candidate in the next election. Somehow we have to change the cultural momentum. So how do we do that? Well, if I was in front of you at Weymouth Church on Sunday or something, I would have a lot of spiritual answers to that question. So if you're interested in those, come to church. I have a couple things that I've thought through that I think are based on those spiritual principles, but have great import to a group like MCFAN. I started to think, if the answer is actually cultural, and I believe behind that spiritual, then what does a political action group do to help? Where do we even begin? And so I go back to my own story. And I think, well, I know that I grew up in a family where a lot of the cultural problems that we could look around and say, families are breaking apart. People are growing up without strong fathers, or people are growing up in a world where their lives are saturated with media to the point where they don't really have independent thought anymore. And we can identify all of that. And then I think, I was on that road too. When I was a young boy, my father was, into drugs. He was an alcoholic. He worked 2.5 jobs. He was almost never home. My mom and dad were on the very brink of divorce, and our family was about to fall apart. And we know the story. When that happens, what happens to the kids in that situation? Not every time, but many times. They end up having to depend on government. And there's many other problems that are bigger than that happen for those kids, but in a political context, that sets them up now for a very different outcome where they end up politically, because their family wasn't the support that it needed to be. And ultimately they grow up and the government really is in that provider, protector role that their family needed to be. So I could have been there, but there was a great spiritual awakening in my family. My father turned to God, and as a result our whole life changed as a family, and the rest is history for us. We went a whole different direction than we could have. So then I start to think, well, what kinds of truths did I learn because I grew up in a strong family versus so many people today, so sadly, who grow up and we know, I don't really have to give you statistics, you know the kind of the dire situation we're in when it comes to just cultural disintegration and family life. So, I'd like to offer 2 answers to that question, and I'd like for you to ruminate on this a little bit, think about it for a while. I don't claim to be an expert to look at the whole culture and say I've got the answer, this is it. But I've got one answer from practical experience and one answer that I derive from a biblical explanation of what happens to cultures. So I'll start with that. In Romans 1 in the Bible, there's a kind of a sad decline of culture that is outlined. And at the beginning of that decline, the Apostle Paul writes that 2 things happened. One is, the culture did not give God its rightful place. Okay, so we can all say, well, that's fairly obvious. So we'll just grant that. But the other piece that I want to focus on is that that culture ceased to be grateful. That gratefulness, or the lack thereof, is the beginning of cultural decline. Now, it took me a while to arrive at this conclusion, but this is the thought that struck me on Tuesday night, somewhere around 9:45, when I started to think, how could we lose? How could people knowingly vote away the very principles that made them and their parents prosper for the years past? And it started to dawn on me that Romans 1 is onto something. And that is, when you lose gratefulness, you lose everything else. Because gratefulness is how we appreciate value. And once you don't understand value, then it doesn't matter to you where it comes from. And it doesn't matter to you how much it takes to earn it or what it takes to keep it. Your life becomes very self-centered. When you say the words thank you, you do something that takes what you perceive to be valuable and you hand it back in the form of appreciation to the person who made it possible, or to the principle that made it possible, or to God who made it possible. But if you don't say thank you, all of life is simply about you. Now, what does that mean? Think of what we call, in our circles, the entitlement mentality. How would you define that? Well, if we're using the terms that I'm suggesting today, we could say, really, what is the entitlement mentality? It's a terrific loss of gratefulness. Because instead of believing that this value was created by someone and is now being shared with you, you start to think that you're entitled to receive it. You start to believe that, in fact, people owe you more than you're getting. And you look at someone who you think ought to give you more, and rather than being grateful for the great contribution they've made to your life, what starts to fill your heart? Envy. Churchill said that socialism is the gospel of envy. Envy fills your heart rather than gratefulness, and that changes the cultural momentum. Because now, when we look at one of those evil rich people, What are we looking for them? Well, why are we looking? We're saying they ought to do more. They have more than me. It's not fair. And so if someone stands up and says, I'll take money from that rich person and give it to you, you say amen to that. They should give more. But if your heart's filled with gratefulness, how do you view that? You look and you say, wow, that value was created or passed down to that person. That's not mine. If they happen to share some of that with me, I'm going to say thank you. I'm not going to demand more. There's a lot of other expressions of what happens in gratefulness. For example, in families, if you say the words thank you to your spouse, just those words could set your marriage and thus your family on a course toward restoration instead of breakup. Now, I know there's lots more to it, but I'm just challenging you to think about how significant the simple two words, thank you, are and what they mean in our culture. And then when we kind of profile those people that represent, in our minds, the entitlement mentality, and I wouldn't just limit this to the cities or kind of traditionally, where this could be in any of our hearts, kind of lingering in there, where we look around and we start to think people owe us something that we didn't earn. And once that thought dawns on us, if we don't overwhelm that with gratefulness and say, no, I am grateful for what God and what people have given to me, the opportunities America has afforded to me, well, as soon as our hearts fill with envy, we lose the ability to function, I believe, as a free republic. Because suddenly, all of us are in this for ourselves. It simply doesn't